I think it's a good time to start now. And in case we have any late runners, that should be no problem to join in as we go. Big welcome to everyone. Great to see so many of you. I hope everyone can understand me and see my screen. If not, please let me know. But as long as I don't hear anything from you, I assume everything is going well. Yeah, good morning to those of you who tune in from Europe and Africa, and good afternoon for everyone participating from Asia and Australia, and good night in case anyone happens to be, like I am, on the west coast of the US. Yeah, today's webinar is on risk-based approaches, and we want to give a little overview of the risk-based approaches, its challenges, and its opportunities. Before I jump into the content, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. In case you haven't done so, I would kindly ask you to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. There should be a little button on the bottom left of your screen with an icon of a microphone, so you can click that to activate and deactivate your microphone. We have a dedicated time for questions at the end, and I think it makes sense to do that at the end of the presentation, so we can make sure to go through as much content as possible. You can use the chat box to help remember and share your questions and comments. Either you can send them to everyone or to me directly. And if there shouldn't be enough time for all of your questions, please write them down either in the chat or send me an email, and we can do a follow-up Q&A. There's also the option to raise your hand during this presentation, and in particular during the Q&A, when I can take a look at the participants list so I can see if you want to speak up. There's one more thing. The HCV Resource Network would love to share and make accessible this webinar to as many people as possible, also to those who cannot participate. And oops, what's happening here? And so we are thinking of providing this webinar on our website and YouTube channel. This could happen either just the part that I am presenting on, or including the Q&A. If you have any problems with this being published, please let me know before the end of this, and we definitely respect that. So yeah, just drop me a message either in the text or via email. Great. Why is there a red line in the screen? I'm just going to stop sharing really quick and share again, because for some reason there was a random red line on my screen. All right. Quickly walking you through the agenda for today. We already ticked off point 1, which is great. Welcome on housekeeping. Want to give a brief overview of the HCV approach, what it is, what the HCV are, and what HCVs are, and how it can be used. Then I want to talk about some of the challenges of the HCV identification, because that will directly inform what we're going to say about risk-based approaches. A quick intro to the HCV Resource Network Assessor licensing scheme. Some of these points will be familiar to some of you, but I think they're important to cover to get a baseline for everyone who's listening in today. Point 5 is probably what everyone's waiting for, the risk-based approaches itself. I want to give a quick introduction, how they work or how it works and how they can be implemented. And then to give the whole thing a little more context, I want to show how risk-based approaches in practice can look like with the example of the Better Cotton Initiative. And then if time allows, we want to talk through some example cases, and then in the end have a Q&A session to address all of the potential questions that might come up during the presentation. So starting with the HCV approach in 5 minutes, very basic question in the beginning. What does HCV stand for? HCV stands for high conservation values. And what are these high conservation values? They are defined as biological, ecological, social, or cultural values, which are considered outstandingly significant or critically important at the national, regional, or global level. There are 6 categories of HCV. HCV 1 is species diversity. That could be something like a rare, threatened, or an endangered species, like in this case, an orangutan. HCV 2 looks more at the larger scale, namely landscape level ecosystems, mosaics, or intact forest landscapes. And an example could be, for example, the intact forest landscape, or just a wider landscape that is considered significant in the context. HCV 3 looks at ecosystems and habitats, and that could be things that are a little more comprehensive, for example, a grassland and all the species, both flora and fauna, that it includes. HCV 1 to 3 are what we often describe as the natural or environmental HCVs, because they address natural features such as species or ecosystems. HCV 4 is leading a little bit to the more social side of the HCVs, namely ecosystem services, which are per definition values that humans derive from nature, so bridging the natural and the human world here. An example would be the Portuguese Montado, which is a human-shaped landscape that is both very high in biodiversity, but also provides services to humans such as water retention, purification, as well as cultural and regulating services. HCV 5 are community needs. In the little image you can see, for example, fire, wood, and fuel that is critical for a local community. And HCV 6 as another social service are cultural values, and that could be sites that are of cultural or historic importance to the people that are affected. The HCV approach is carried out in 3 phases, and each of these phases are important and equally ranked, and it starts with the identification. So what are the potential HCVs in a region? Which of these values actually occur in the region, and where are these values located? In a second phase, you look at the management of these HCV areas, and for that you want to identify the threats that exist to these values. You want to define the area that is needed to maintain them, and you want to think about how the landscapes should be managed in order to maintain the HCVs. And thirdly is monitoring, and you need to identify what needs to be monitored, how it will be monitored, and how the results of that monitoring will be used to inform future decisions. So I hope I stuck to the 5 minutes, but I think I did a quite good job on the time. And that would lead us to the challenges of HCV identification. The HCV approach often takes place in, so to say, high risk areas. So that means that it's an area where the conversion of a landscape is likely to affect the high conservation values that are present in this landscape. And the challenge in that is that the HCV assessment of identifying these high conservation values needs to be thorough. So that would be, the first challenge would be location and the fact that there's a high likelihood of HCVs being affected. The second challenge about HCV identification is complexity. HCV assessments are conducted across geographies, commodities, and by a wide range of people. So that means that the context for each HCV assessment is different, which again introduces the complexity. A wide set of skills and experience is required from the assessors to adequately deal with this complexity. And that poses a challenge to the consistency of HCV assessments. So we have location and complexity. And thirdly, that HCV assessments need to cater different needs. So HCV assessments have to be comprehensive, robust, and ideally audited for quality, because we're looking at the values of high conservation values, and we want to protect those. So having comprehensive, robust, and potentially quality audited assessments takes a lot of resources and time. In many, or in most cases, it's essential to carry them out in a very thorough way, but there might be situations in which a full HCV assessment could be considered as too much, for example, where the landscape is already quite degraded, and maybe carrying out a full assessment isn't actually necessary. So we sometimes refer to it as an overkill, and again, yeah, that could happen where the presence of HCV is unlikely. So referring that back to point 3, you kind of need to look at what the different needs are in certain situations. So that is another challenge to HCV identification. And as a fourth point or fourth challenge, we identified that users have different opportunities and resources. For example, a large corporation will have different resources than a smallholder, and the HCV approach needs to be flexible to work for different users, but also robust to protect the HCV areas and communities that depend on them. So this is sort of the field of tension that we're looking at. And the big question is, how can we address these challenges that we just mentioned? And that will lead me actually to the next point in the agenda, which is the Assessor licensing scheme. The Assessor licensing scheme is the HCV Resource Network's quality assurance system. And what it does, it licenses lead HCV assessors to conduct HCV identification assessments, and it conducts independent quality panel reviews of HCV reports. The ALS aims to improve the assessor's planning for and conduct of HCV identification, to reduce variability in quality of HCV identification reports, to streamline HCV reporting, and to facilitate monitoring of HCV assessors' work and ensure the quality thereof. So you can already see that some of the challenges that I mentioned before are partially being addressed by the Assessor licensing scheme. And the ones most prominently addressed are the location and the complexity. So as I mentioned earlier, the conduct of HCV assessments is challenging, and the quality of assessments has varied in the past. The ALS addresses these points directly, namely through licensing of assessors and an independent quality panel revision, thereby ensuring consistent and high quality HCV assessments. So out of the 4 challenges that I mentioned earlier, the ALS is actively addressing 2 of them, namely location and complexity, or the varying of the quality of the assessments. Excuse me. And that would lead me to point 5, risk-based approaches. And I'm going to give a little introduction and then look how these can work and how they can be implemented. Why risk-based approaches? Why are they necessary? And this is a little bit going back to some of the challenges that I mentioned. HCV approach is for challenging environments where there's a high likelihood of HCV presence. HCV assessments are complex and comprehensive, and they are across geographies and commodities. And HCV identification needs to be a robust and meticulous process. And the risk-based approach can address that by having procedures and reporting of HCVs commensurate with different risk levels. And these are low, elevated, or high risk levels. Thinking about risk, or we define risk, or we see different risk components for HCV risk-based approaches, and there's 4 of them. And the first component is scale. So the scale could be, for example, the size of the operation, thinking about the forest management of a larger area, and then the size of the plant expansion, so the actual area of the proposed conversion. A second risk component is intensity, looking at things, for example, do we have a new development, or are we looking at a established plantation? What are the management practices of the case that we're looking at? For example, what is water use? What is the water use? Are pesticides being used? What are the harvesting practices? What are the frequencies of interventions, and so on? A third risk component is the probability of HCV presence. And that would change, for example, in a natural landscape versus an agricultural landscape, or the lifestyle of the affected people. For example, are we talking about a more modern or a traditional lifestyle? And these things affect the likelihood or probability of HCVs being present in that area. And the fourth risk component is the sensitivity of the HCV to the development. So how much will the proposed development affect the potentially present HCV? These 4 points together determine the risk of a proposed development. So each of them can vary, and altogether will lead to the final analysis or result of the risk-based assessment. The next point would be to look at the implementation of HCV requirements for a specific standard, for example. And for that, we envision a stepwise approach. And the first step in this would be that you collect background data and information about the risk associated with the production and expansion for a given commodity. So depending on the standard or organization that wants to develop a risk-based approach, specific data and information needs to be collected on how that, on the risks that are associated with that. The second step is then to develop the risk assessment tools, and that would include indicators and thresholds, and would be used by farmers and managers. So that would be documents that can be used in order to assess the risk. And then the third point would be to actually use these risk assessment tools to determine the actual risk level, again, high, elevated, or low. And that would then guide the appropriate HCV procedures. So these are the 3 steps of how a risk-based approach could be implemented into a standard. Here I want to take a closer look at the HCV procedures based on a risk assessment. So I spoke about the points high risk, elevated risk, and low risk earlier, and these different risk levels will trigger different actions. Starting here on the top, A high-risk scenario would require full-scale HCV identification assessment carried out by an ALS licensed assessor prior to the development. The contrasting case would be a low-risk scenario. In this case, the potentially present HCVs are identified and mitigation measures are adopted to maintain these HCVs where they might occur. And then in between these two points is the elevated risk scenario. And the elevated risk scenario could, for example, trigger a further scoping to validate potentially present HCVs and identify ways to mitigate the impact on those. And this could be done through, for example, through field visits or through stakeholder or expert consultations. As I mentioned earlier, circumstances can be different, and so can risk-based approaches be the solution to those. So geographies, commodities, scale, and other factors have an impact on how risk-based identification of HCVs can be realized. I mentioned it earlier, smallholders, for example, face different challenges than large producers, and commodities can vary significantly in the way they are produced, sourced, and managed. And that definitely varies also with the geographies and with the typical size, for example, of the operations. So this means then that it's difficult to have a one-fits-all solution. So what I introduced earlier was more like an abstract level, like a high-level way of how we envision risk-based approaches to be structured and implemented. But it wasn't super detailed yet, and that is because it is difficult to have one fits all solution because of the varying context of the different commodities and standards. But the HCV Resource Network can work closely and has done so with individual standards to develop tailored risk-based solutions for HCV identification to make sure that the different requirements and needs are addressed adequately and that the risk-based toolkit is applicable to the standard. Excuse me. And that then leads me to the next point, which is actually the risk-based approach in practice. And here we have the Better Cotton Initiative example. The HCV Resource Network developed a risk-based approach solution for the Better Cotton Initiative, and we finished that project the end of last year. And we want to present this here as an example of how this abstract idea of risk-based approaches can actually be applied in practice. Excuse me, my voice is failing, unfortunately, but yeah, I'll try to keep the coughing to a minimum. Sorry about that. A little bit of background data to the BCI. The BCI counts 1.5 million licensed farmers worldwide who produce cotton on 3.5 million hectares, so quite substantial numbers there. And the BCI revised the standards, and that revised standard requires that all conversion is preceded by an assessment of the risk that any high conservation value is negatively impacted upon by the proposed land use change. And in this quote, I think the key words are preceded and the risk to the high conservation value, because that means that prior to any conversion, a risk-based assessment needs to be carried out. So as I said, the HCVRN developed a toolkit for the BCI standard, and that includes two separate approaches to risk analysis. One is for smallholders, and then one for medium and large farms. Again, this links back to the fact that smallholders have very different resources and opportunities compared to medium or large farms, and therefore we saw it necessary to differentiate a little bit in the risk analysis. Further documents include a guidance for experts on specific topics which are relevant to the BCI. Again, I spoke about this earlier, that different standards and commodities have different requirements. And for example, for the BCI, we identified that a guidance for steep slopes or local water security was necessary to be developed. So this is just a little bit of background on our project with BCI and the solutions that we came up with them. Now I want to talk a little bit about the process of how a risk analysis is actually carried out. So as I mentioned before any development, an initial risk assessment has to be carried out, and that is the case for both smallholders and medium and large farms. This risk assessment includes a set of yes and no questions, and these always lead to one or to two of three outcomes. So each question could either lead to low, elevated, or high risk, and I'm just going to talk through the consequences here. So if low risk is identified for a question, that means that the manager can proceed to the next question, and that goes on until all questions are answered. If the case is that all questions, all outcomes of the questions are low risk, that means that the conversion can be carried out without the use of the assessor licensing scheme. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the high risk outcome of a question. And whenever this happens, whenever a high risk is identified, the use of the assessor licensing scheme and an ALS licensed assessor is required. And then again, we have the elevated risk scenario. And the elevated risk scenario differentiates between smallholders and the medium and large farms. So smallholders need to mitigate any potential risks to the HCVs. So that means that conversion can go ahead, but only with mitigation measures in place. These can be identified with the guidance documents and with the help of the manager. For medium and large farms, if elevated risk is the outcome of one of the questions, an extended risk analysis is triggered. And that extended risk analysis requires the use of an expert and can again have two separate outcomes. And the outcome that allows conversion is either the same as identified with the smallholders, namely that the conversion can go ahead, but it requires mitigation measures to be in place. But it could also be the case that the extended risk analysis shows that actually the risk is low, so reclassification happens, and then conversion could be carried out without the use of a ALS assessor. The other case of the extended risk analysis is that high risk is actually identified through the expert, and that means again that the ALS is required. So you can see from the colors already that there's green, orange, and red in the beginning, but on the bottom you only have green and red, meaning that either conversion can go ahead in one way or the other, or that the ALS is required. So these sort of 3 strings eventually will become 2. And how this looks in practice, I want to show here to just give you a bit of a feeling on how these guidance documents look like. As I said, there's a set of questions that the manager has to go through. And here we picked one question that asks if the proposed conversion area is located in or closer than 2 kilometers to an intact forest landscape. Remember, intact forest landscape, HCV2. If the answer to that question is no, you can proceed to the next question. That was what I mentioned in the previous slide. That would be the case on the left side with the green arrows. So yeah, answer is no, there's no risk, next question. If the answer is yes, that actually triggers an elevated risk scenario. And then that would ask the question is the PCA located in or overlapping with an intact forest landscape? If the answer to that is yes, the final outcome of this question would be that conversion is not allowed in an intact forest landscape. If the answer to that question is no, but the proposed conversion area or part of that is closer than 2 kilometers to an intact forest landscape, that means that conversion requires prior assessment by an HCV licensed assessor. Again, here you can see that having a low risk scenario will let you proceed to the next question, whereas having a high risk scenario will automatically require the use of an HCV licensed assessor. Just to remind you, this has been developed for the BCI specifically, and it is not necessarily how every risk-based approach would look like, but this is what actually has been developed in collaboration with an existing standard, and I think it kind of shows a good, or like it exemplifies quite well how the logic and functioning of that of the risk-based approach would work. Here's another example, and this one I chose because it shows a little bit more about the elevated risk. The question is if the PCA is closer than 100 meters to a river, stream, ditch, canal, pond, or lake, so any sort of water body. The answer is no. You can proceed to question 8 or to the next question. The answer is yes. That triggers the elevated risk scenario. And I don't want to read out the full text, but it basically says that there are certain risks of leakage from pesticides or fertilizers, and that could affect the quality of water or lead to pollution. And it also suggests certain mitigation impacts. For example, do not clear, plant, or use any pesticides or fertilizers in the buffer zone. Do not dump waste or sewage. And so these mitigation measures then need to be agreed with the production unit manager, and water management plan needs to be updated accordingly. Again, this is BCI terminology. But the basic message here is that an elevated risk is identified, but there's mitigation measures which then need to be implemented. And if that's the case, conversion can go ahead. I'll just have a quick look at the time, and I see that we do have a few minutes left actually. So I can actually talk a little bit about point 7. And this is point 7 is a few example cases just to again showcase the functioning of the risk-based approach and when it would apply and how it would apply. So we have a fictional case here in which a smallholder proposes the conversion of an area of 8 hectares, and the PCA complies with all legal provisions. The farmer has the full tenure of the land. There's no other legal or customary right claims to that land, and the area doesn't overlap with a protected area or a key biodiversity area. So these are questions that would be asked in the questionnaires, and they're all answered positively. But the proposed conversion area is 2 kilometers away from an intact forest landscape. And that means it is a high-risk scenario also for the smallholder. And the conversion requires prior assessment by an HCVRN licensed assessor. In our fictional case 2, we have a medium farm with a proposed conversion of 50 hectares. And again, there's a set of questions, and the PCA complies with all legal provisions. It's not located in or close to an intact forest landscape. The farmer has the full tenure rights. There's no other legal or customer right claims. PCA is not closer than 100 meters to a river, stream, or lake, and it doesn't overlap with a protected area, and it's not located in a key biodiversity area. But the PCA is located on a steep slope. So this would then trigger the elevated risk scenario, and that means in the example of BCI that we would consult the extended risk analysis guidance on HCV4 steep slopes. The steep slope is less than 1 meter vertical in 2 meters horizontal, which will then trigger the use of an expert for an extended risk analysis. That expert then will conduct the extended risk analysis and come to a conclusion, which he or she will write down in a report. And in this case, it's that implementation of mitigation measures and a soil management plan will need to be carried out. So that question being answered, following questions will be asked. For example, that the proposed area is not irrigated with surface water, it doesn't require clearing, the area has been used for crop cultivation in the prior 3 years, and the PCA cultivation does not require measures to drain excess water. If all these points are ticked off, it actually leads to a low risk scenario, and the conversion can go ahead if the implementation measures are being if the mitigation measures are being implemented, and if a biodiversity management plan is developed. And with that, the risk assessment for the medium farm would end. And this actually brings me to the end of the quick presentation on risk-based approaches. And I've seen quite a few flashes in my chat window, so I think there are a bunch of questions, and I'm happy to have a look at them and answer.
Hi, Mario. This is Paulina. Hi, everyone. I'm Paulina, the Executive Director of the HCV Network. I've been trying to answer to some of the questions, but maybe you want to go through them and see if you have other things to say. We're also going to compile all these questions and put them together and then share them with the participants so you can have more thorough answers, because the chat doesn't allow for very long answers. I guess some of the questions are related to what happens if people on the ground, so if the farmers are in charge of implementing these procedures, how fail-safe or how sure are we that people are doing or implementing them correctly? So the quick answer to that is we don't know. So I mean, these are procedures that are being developed for the standard, and we're assuming that the standard has certain safeguards to make sure that these procedures are being implemented properly. But obviously, there could always be misuse. So our recommendation is always that these are used alongside other safeguards, such as verification, from third-party bodies or whoever is, or depending on how the standard works, basically. But I don't know, Marius, if you want to say something else about that.
No, I think that was good.
I think there are some other questions. So there was one at the beginning saying, excuse my ignorance, are the risks being considered related to a proposed development affecting a known HCV area or where the HCVs have yet to be identified? And the answer to that was that this is for a proposed development area where we may have some information on potential HCVs or we may not have information. So in some countries, for example, there's a lot of information about certain areas. So in those cases, it could be relatively straightforward to have some sort of indication of what could be present there. There are some other countries where there's very little information. So in those cases, you would need to, those potentially would categorize as high risk, for example, or I mean, it depends on the context, basically, and how much information is available. But it's for proposed areas where we may not know a lot about what is there. I'm seeing a lot of questions there.
Is there a limit to determining large or medium farms?
I guess I will, yeah, well, go ahead, Marius, maybe you have an answer to that one.
Yeah, I think this depends on the standard and the commodity, because usually they have a way of identifying that, but it's not that the HCVRN has like a certain limit, because it varies too much depending on the commodity or standard.
Yeah. There's another question related to quality assurance. So is the quality or the verification a key I mean, that they're saying it's a key, Mike is saying it's a key component. So do these always have to be conducted by a third party? So for high-risk scenarios, we have the HCV Resource Network has the HCV Assessor licensing scheme, which is our quality assurance system for HCV assessments that are conducted by licensed assessors. So in the risk-based approach, any scenario or any assessment that is done by a licensed assessor would have to go through that quality assurance system. So in that sense, yes, we are the third party that checks the assessments in those cases. But for assessments that are lower risk, then we basically rely on the standards verification system. So maybe that means that that an auditor or a certification body at some point in the certification process would have to go check that area to make sure that these procedures were implemented correctly, or some other procedure could be developed as part of the standard to make sure that the procedures were implemented well. But that, again, will depend very much on how each standard operates. And then Seb is asking if we have more information on other standards that are, I think that are going to adopt risk-based approaches for HCV assessments. So far, in collaboration with Proforest, we developed a similar approach for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, and this is the second attempt to do something similar for a Better Cotton initiative. We've been under discussion with Bonsucro for a while about potentially having something like this for them, but the conversations are still at a very early stage. So far, it's only Better Cotton Initiative and the RSPO. Let me see what else is there. There are some that we're not answering, but we'll make sure that we answer those in a question and answer sheet and share with everyone.
One that I can answer, can we get the presentation material? I mentioned that earlier, that we'd actually really like to share the webinar online, so it should be accessible, and then therefore also, we can share the presentation material.
There's another question here by Ellen, but I think it was asked by someone else. So will HCVRN authorize any risk-based approaches, or can anyone develop one? What safeguards are in place to avoid approaches that downplay potential risks? That's a very good question, actually, and we haven't developed an internal procedure to kind of authorize risk-based approaches, but it is the idea that anything that has the HCV name on it, or any standard that uses this kind of approach, is firstly a member of the HCV Resource Network, which means that they have to comply with certain commitments that we have, for example, following the charter, which says that you won't damage HCVs. And so firstly, we would try to work with our members and standards that are members of the network. We can't really control if someone else comes up with with an with a methodology or a risk-based approach, but we will try to have a procedure to approve or help at least develop those approaches for other standards as well. This is still very young, so we're trying to figure all these things out. So if you have ideas, also let us know. Okay, there's another one. Is the BCI model, including initial self-assessment by farmer, a common one? Are there other standards using different models? Again, tricky question. So we know that RSPO is doing it in a similar way. I'm not sure. We have a few people from FSC, so maybe they can tell us more how this is, if there's something similar in FSC. I don't think so, but I know they have some procedures for smallholders, or at least those were being developed. But
Well, I may try to answer here.
Hi, Pasi.
Hi, Paulina. We try to avoid this self-assessment as much as we can, but it's quite challenging. What we aim to do, we try to have in each country HCV framework where we have a kind of risk-based approach related to the best available information. So we are saying that the smallholders would have a bit easier set of best available information than the bigger ones. But still, we are trying to have these HCV frameworks defined at the national level by the standard development group. So there would be ready-made risk assessment for each and every certificate holder by an independent party. This is not easy to make it, but we have so bad experiences on situations where the certificate holders themselves define the risk that leads to bias the results too easily.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So again, the idea of the risk-based procedures is that we provide an easier, like a more simple or a simplified alternative for those stakeholders that would struggle to pay for a very expensive or a very comprehensive HCV assessment for an area that maybe doesn't need one just because the level of risk is lower. So in those particular cases, I mean, we're still saying that for high-risk cases or where there is a lot of possibility of presence of HCVs, you would still have an independent HCV assessment that is quality controlled by the HCV Resource Network. So in those cases, there is a third-party verification. In lower risk cases, then there is no third party, at least from our side, we wouldn't be checking those, but the standards could develop internal procedures to make sure that self-assessment is not done incorrectly. So Nana is asking whether there are procedures developed, risk-based procedures for RSPO. So for smallholders, for existing plantings by smallholders, there is a procedure already. For new plantings by smallholders, I think it has been developed, and there's also an app associated to that, but it hasn't been formally approved. That's what I understand. So we're waiting on that. Mike Senior is also just to respond at the same thing. So Surin from Proforest is asking if some of the risk assessment methods are mentioned in the common guidance. Can these be used for the time being? Another tricky question. So I'll come back to you on that one, Surin. The common guidance is guidance, so it's open for interpretation, but yeah, we don't recommend one or the other. I guess to us, the most important thing right now is working very closely with all the standards to help them come up with solutions, because as you all may know, some standards are very strict in the way that HCV is used, the methodology, and some others are quite flexible in the sense that they may require identification, but they don't tell farmers or their stakeholders exactly how that needs to be done, or whether it needs to be quality control, or whether there is a risk-based approach for that identification. So what we're trying to do at the network right now is just approach every standard that we know is using HCV and try to identify how they are using it and how it could work in their specific context. Because palm oil and forestry and cotton and sugar and all these other commodities are extremely different, and they operate in very different contexts. So the levels of risk are very different and the threats are very different. the size of farms are very different. So to us, the most important thing right now is just to start engaging with the standards. And as I said, this is still under development, and we've only trialed these two approaches, and we're still to see how they work. But yeah, these are not. We don't have all the answers to your questions, basically. At this point, we'll try to come back with as many answers as possible. Michael is asking whether there will be a common support to HCVRN to harmonize all the risk analysis out there. I'm not sure I understand your question, but I guess you're referring to whether we're going to try to make sure that all the risk-based approaches are similar or have the same safeguards. And the quick answer would be yes. So that's why we're trying to engage with all the standards very proactively. We may be missing questions that were written before. So Marius, how do you want to go about this?
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through and see if there's anything that we've missed. Maybe also if anyone feels like their question has been answered, if you could just post it again, that would be super helpful.
Mike Reed is asking, what are the next steps on this for HCVRN? So with Better Cotton Initiative in particular, we have sent these procedures to them, and now they need to go into a trial phase. So we're sensing that after that trial phase, we'll have a lot more feedback on how the standard is feeling about its implementation, and then potential modifications that need to be made. So again, this is the first effort for Better Cotton Initiative. We still have to see how it works on the ground. So we're very keen on seeing the results of that. And the other next step is that we still have to develop some other guidance for specific areas. So for example, BCI particularly needs a lot more guidance on water and how to manage water resources, because cotton is a very water intensive crop and potential damages could be related to that. So they're thinking now that they need maybe some more detailed guidance on how to manage that. So we're thinking about developing that for them. With RSPO, I guess we're waiting for that to be approved. So, and that will also be associated to a trial, well, not a trial period, but I guess it'll be interesting to see how it works the first year or so, and then potentially make modifications based on that in collaboration with Proforest and all the other partners that are working very closely on this one. So yeah, so this is a first attempt. It's the first time we've done it, so we're still very curious to see how it works on the ground and what kind of other safeguards need to be implemented for this to work properly.
Yeah, I guess we would also like to see eventually to have more of like a framework to the risk-based approaches, right? Like something that's a bit more like widely applicable.
Exactly. There's another one from Mike Senior. Does the BCI approach include HCV probability maps like the RSPO approach? I don't know, Marius. Do you know?
Not in the same way. Not in the same way that, at least not that I'm aware of.
So we know. I mean, we suggest in the guidance that we produce for BCI, we suggest several maps that people can use or several indicators that people can use, but there is no plan to map formally like the RSPO did for countries where they are developing, although we have suggested that they take a similar approach, but that hasn't been decided yet. So we're waiting on that. Maybe at some point they will decide that they need probability maps. And it could be that, if these have already been developed for some countries, that potentially the standards could collaborate on that, because that would be the most efficient, I think. So for everyone else in the chat, for RSPO, some HCV probability maps were developed for specific countries where RSPO has large smallholder bases, or where they know smallholders are active and they will need to use their smallholder procedure. So in those cases, these are not HCV maps in the sense that they tell you exactly where the HCV is, but based on certain indicators, then you know whether there's probability of presence or not, and that can guide your risk analysis. So a similar effort would be interesting for other standards where maybe, for example, BCI is operating in a certain country where they know there will be a lot of presence of smallholders, or smaller farms, maybe a map would make it easier to identify potential risk or to guide the expansion into less risky areas or something. There's another question here. Do you see if there is a way to have risk assessments for HCV to be somehow aligned with HCS, or any work on this was previously done where these approaches were addressed in one standard, or would it be better to keep HCV risk assessments separate from HCS? I'm assuming you're referring to the HCS approach and not just the high carbon stock as a term. So we are working very closely with, So with the HCS approach, we're working very closely to develop, firstly, quality assurance procedures for high risk assessments. So maybe you know, or maybe you don't, but very recently we launched an HCV assessment manual to guide licensed assessors on how to do these assessments on the ground. The next step is helping them potentially come up with procedures for how HCV identification could happen at a smallholder scale and at a jurisdictional scale as well. But so far we have only developed procedures for standard HCV assessments or assessments done by licensed assessor in concessions or in management units that are very defined. So the HCS approach is still very new. So there are a lot of questions to be answered with regards to smallholders, larger contexts, high forest cover landscapes, for example, where this is not necessarily applicable because the methodology was originally developed to be applicable in fragmented landscapes. So there are still a lot of discussions going on. Mike Senior, just to confirm that he was agreeing with my answer to the question, but HCSA are talking about adopting risk-based approaches for smallholders. Mike, maybe you want to elaborate on that one. You can unmute yourself, or can you not? His mic is not working. So yeah, but HCSA are talking about adopting risk-based approaches for smallholders. So the HCV Resource Network actually proposed a procedure that is it's based on our thinking with BCI and RSPO, basically, on something similar could work for HCSA. But this hasn't been discussed by the smallholder working group in detail, and we haven't really received much feedback on that proposal. So I can't really comment in a lot of detail on that. Can the risk-based approach be used to assess the level of risk of areas mapped in the HCV probability map? So the way the probability maps work, in RSPO at least, is that you, based on certain indicators like land cover and a lot of other data on species or whatever has been made available for that country, because each country is different and they have different maps and different quality of maps. Based on that, then you would know the incidence of, well, the probability of presence, and based on the probability of presence, you would decide to go for one area or the other. So you would still have to do some sort of check on that area where you want to expand, but the objective of the maps is to basically, at a very coarse level, guide expansion into areas that we know are less risky just by seeing certain indicators. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe not. Okay, so I guess it's 10 a.m. already, so I'm in London. So what we can do, I guess, Marius, as a next step is pull together all the questions that come up in this webinar and the other webinar that we're going to have in Spanish, and then share the answers or our attempt to answer your questions with all the participants. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Happy to do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
I guess it's, oh, well, there's one new message. Oh, well done. Thanks.
Well done, Marius.
That's the kind of message we like.
Good. Well, we're happy to share more information. We can't share the actual procedures because they're BCI owned, but we can share more information on the general methodology. We don't know if they're going to be public either, so maybe at some point they will be public, but I think right now they're being reviewed by BCI. But anyways, thanks so much, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and we will follow up on this topic. And yeah, if there's any